If you've just finished quilting your first quilt and you're ready to put the binding on, I have the video for you. I'm going to go step by step exactly how to put on a binding on your quilt. First, let's talk about why you want to have a separate binding put on instead of just folding the back over to the front. Traditionally, separate bindings were put on quilts because they would need to be replaced. This edge along the edge of the quilt gets the most wear, and if you use a separate piece of fabric and put that on separately, when it wears through, you can just replace it. But I have two better reasons to do that, because probably you're thinking you're not going to have that much use on your quilt that you're going to need to replace a binding. The first reason is that it adds the opportunity for an extra design element. This green around the edge actually adds a little pop. It brings out this inner bit here, and so it's just fun to have another color and fabric to play with by using a separate binding. And the second reason, and the one I really like, is that it's easier. It's easier to add a separate binding than to fold over the back and try to make that look neat. So I promise you it's going to be easy, and let's get started. The very first thing you're going to need is a bunch of strips of fabric cut for the binding. Now, if your sewing pattern doesn't tell you how many of these strips to cut, I will tell you how to calculate that. You just want to take the perimeter of your quilt, so measure around all the edges, add them up, add 12 inches, and then divide by 40 inches. We're dividing by 40 inches because that's generally a safe amount of how wide fabric really is. So if your fabric is some other width other than 42 or so inches, divide by that width of fabric. When you divide, you're going to probably get an odd number, and you're going to round up to the next highest number, whole number, and then you're going to cut that many strips. So my quilt here is 26 inches square, so the perimeter of the quilt is 26 times 4, 104 inches. I'm going to add 12 inches. That's 116 inches, and I'm going to divide that by 40. And I get 2.9 strips. I would round that up to 3 strips. It's making me a little nervous, so I'm actually going to cut 4 strips. And the most common width of binding strip to cut is 2.5 inches. So get your strips ready, cut them out, and then we'll get started at piecing them into one long strip. When piecing binding strips together, you could theoretically just piece them straight like this and sew the ends together like that. But I like to do a diagonal seam because it reduces bulk. I'll show you how to do the diagonal seam, and then later on I will show you how it's reducing bulk. You do want to start by putting your right sides together. I have a batik here, so it's a little harder to see what the right and the wrong side might be. They don't really have a right and wrong side, but you lay them across each other like this, just at right angles to each other, and then you sew across to make a little hat. So I'm just going to sew from corner to corner. Keeping these at right angles, and just sew corner to corner. Now, then when I'm making a whole bunch of these, I turn this over so the right side would be up again. Take my next strip, lay it on top like this, and sew from corner to corner. And you do that until you have all your binding strips done. By sewing corner to corner like this, after I clip off this edge here, the seam allowances, you'll be able to see that I have a nice diagonal seam. After you trim off the edges, you press the seams open. The regular worry about pressing seams to the sides for quilts doesn't apply here, because no batting is going to squeeze out by the time this binding is folded over a bunch of times. So I press the seams open, and then I press the whole thing in half, wrong sides together, all the way down the length. And now I wanted to show you about why we're doing these diagonal seams, and that's because it spreads out the bulk even more. So the open seams spread out the bulk, and then this seam is actually goes from here over to here. So when this gets folded more times, it even spreads out more. Instead of just having one lump in the same place around the edge of your quilt, this won't be as noticeable. Next, we're going to start to sew it onto the quilt. Before I start sewing the binding on, I lay out the binding on the quilt. And that's because I don't want those seams in the binding to end up on the corners of the quilt. Again, because of bulk, it will just make it a little harder to turn the corner and have everything look nice and neat if there's a seam in the binding right on the corner. Start by leaving about a 12-inch tail, and that's just because it makes it easier when you're doing the joining of the two ends later. And then you're going to lay down the raw edge of the binding. So this is the folded edge up here when I folded it in half, and the raw edge down here right along the quilt. And I stick a pin in it because we're trying to determine where we're going to start, and we want to know that we're going to start there. And one thing is to remember to orient yourself to how you're going to want to sew this binding on. So I do want to have it in my machine like this with the big side out this way, so you want to start going down this way. So I've just laid this binding out around the edge of my quilt. Here's the first seam that's not at a corner. Here's another seam not at a corner, and then it goes all the way around to the end here. And again, look, I cut an extra piece, so I didn't really need to. Here's the last piece that I don't need. But one of the worst things that's ever happens to me is when I run out of binding on the quilt. It's very frustrating. The next thing I'm going to do is take it to the machine. Now you may have noticed that I leave a lot extra here. I haven't trimmed it yet, and I'll talk about why I don't trim it when we get to the point where we're turning the binding over. So let's go to the machine and sew the binding on. Just like when you're doing the quilting on your quilt, you also want to use a walking foot when you're attaching the binding because it is sewing through all those layers. One thing I forgot to mention is here's where we're going to start. You also want to put a pin way back here, about a foot or so before that, so that you remember to stop there, and so you don't sew too close to where you're going to start. It makes it a little easier when you're doing the joining. And again, I'm just going to line up the edge of my binding, the raw edge. This is the folded edge here, and this is the raw edge. I'm lining it up with the raw edge of the quilt, and I'm going to sew it on with a 1/4 inch seam. You want to make sure you use a 1/4 inch seam because, again, you want your squares to be squares, right? If you use like a 1-inch seam, then you would have a rectangle instead of square when you wanted to have a square. So you're going to use that same seam allowance you used with doing all the piecing. At some point, you're going to come to a corner. Hopefully you'll come to 4 corners. I'm approaching a corner here, so I'm going to stop a 1/4 inch before the corner. And the best way I've found to do this, to mark it, is to actually just put a pin in here a 1/4 inch before, and it'll stick out and I'll see where I'm supposed to stop. So I'm just going to come up to the corner, stop right where that pin is. So there's the corner. There's the corner where I stopped. And this is what we're going to do to turn the corner. We're going to turn this up like this. So this edge is lining up with this edge, and this makes a nice diagonal fold here. So it's folded up like that, and then I fold it back down just like that. You can feel under here would be that folded edge, and you just start. You can start beyond a little bit, but you're going to just start sewing again the 1/4 inch in. And that's how you're going to do each corner. Here's another corner. I've put my pin in 1/4 inch beforehand. I'm going to sew right up to it. Lift up, but I line this up neatly like this. Then I fold this down like this. And this folded edge should be even with this edge here, the raw edge. And then we just start sewing again. And I've reached my final pin here. And we're ready to join the 2 ends. Joining the 2 ends of the binding with a seam that matches the rest of the seams in the quilt makes everything look very much more professional and neat. And I think a lot of people make it harder on themselves because they try all these other things that don't seem as hard, but I think actually are harder and take more time and futzing. So let me just show you this pretty easy method to do this. The very first thing we're going to do is to cut one of these off right in the middle of the space that we've left to do the binding, joining. So I'm going to cut this right here, right in the middle. And I may not have left as much space as I should have between these 2 ends here, but we'll try to make it work. The next thing is to cut this next piece. What you need to remember is this next piece needs to be cut longer. So it needs to be cut longer. It's going to be cut longer, right? It's going to be cut over here somewhere, and it's going to be cut longer by the width of the binding. That's the amount. So here's my piece that I just cut off. I'm just holding it up here, and this is the width of the binding opened up. Right, here's the binding opened up. There's the fold in the middle. So my binding was 2.5 inches. So this would be 2.5 inches from this edge here. Going to lay this on top, and I'm going to cut that binding right there at that 2.5 inches longer. So I've got it cut. I've got 2 pieces here. And let's go a little closer. So again, we're going to put right sides together. So we're going to take this one, and the fold is pointing out this is the right side. I'm going to put that one there, and I'm going to take this right side with the folds, and they're going to go together like this, matching up the corners and everything, just like when we did the binding joining at the beginning, when we sewed all the strips together. So here we have their right sides together. We've matched the points. There's one fold going this way and one fold going this way behind it. I'm going to pin it a bunch, just because taking it to the machine like this is the hardest part of it, and it's really not that hard. You just have to pin to hold things together. And we're going to sew from this corner to this corner, just like a little hat. I always like to think of it as a little hat. So I'm going to go take this to the machine and sew from this corner to this corner so you can see. So I've sewed from corner to corner. One thing I forgot to mention is to make sure that when you're right before you put these 2 pieces together, that everything's nice and flat here. Nothing's twisted on either of the ends. But so that corner to corner, just like that. I'm going to take out the pins, and this is a really important part. Don't go clipping this off yet. Check it, all right? Check it to make sure everything lies flat. It looks like it's the right length. It should be the right length, but it should lay nice and flat and have no twists in it. So mine looks good. I can cut off this edge, and then I'm going to take it to the ironing board and press it open just like the other one. So I pressed the seam open and then pressed it in half again, laid it out and sewed it right down onto the quilt, and now This whole quilt has one continuous piece of binding. You'd never be able to tell where you started and finished the binding. Next, we're going to cut off this edge, this extra edge, so we'll be able to fold this over to the back. Waiting to cut this off until this point is something I know that I do that's very different from a lot of other quilters. But there are two reasons that I do this. The first reason is because when I was learning to quilt, the wise old quilter that taught me told me that if I left this on, it would help with preventing any wavy edges. The most important part about preventing wavy edges is to make sure you put your borders on, but she also thought this helped. The other reason that I do it, and the reason that I still continue to do that, I never tested to see whether it helped with wavy edges or not, because I think it might, because there's more backing here instead of just an edge, so it won't pull as much and stretch. But the reason that I like to do it is that I like to have nice full bindings. So if I had already cut this off, the binding wouldn't be as full. I like them to be just as full as the rest of the quilt. So this binding is going to be a 1/2 inch wide, and I'm going to cut off now about a 1/2 inch from the binding seam. So I'm lining up my 1/2 inch. Here's my seam that I sewed the binding on with. I'm going to line my 1/2 inch ruler up with that. And I'm going to cut off, and I'm just going to cut off a little bit to start with, just to test to make sure that I like cutting off a 1/2 inch. And I'll show you what I mean here. When I flip this binding over to the back, and I'm going to be sewing it down right there, does this feel like it's all full of binding? I wouldn't want it to be flat and just a fold of fabric here. I want it to have the same amount of batting in it that the rest of the quilt has. So I'm going to cut off everything at a 1/2 inch. I like that. I'm going to cut the whole quilt off at a 1/2 inch from this seam. Also cut the extra binding off all 4 corners. That makes it a little easier when you do the turning of the corners later. Sometimes it even helps to trim a little like that as well. So the very last step is to take the binding and turn it over to the back and sew it to the back. Now I like to hand finish my binding, which means I'm going to show you how to do the hand finish stitch to finish it. I think it's easier actually. I'm not trying to be some snobby quilter that only does hand finished bindings. I just think it's easier than wrangling it through the machine to try to make it look nice. And I don't mind sitting in front of Netflix and doing a little hand sewing after I've done the rest of the quilt. So I'm going to show you how to do that stitch on the back, to sew it on the back by hand. But if you wanted to, you could also flip this over maybe a little bit further, so you might want to cut a little bit more of the batting off, and then you could sew right along the edge here, right along that seam. Again, it's stitching in the ditch, which is kind of hard, and hopefully you'd catch the back. That's why you might want to cut a little bit more off. You'd catch the back of the binding here. Some people also sew from the back and don't mind where it shows up on the front. And then some people also, sometimes they sew it onto the back and then flip it over to the front and then sew it on. So if you want to try some of those other things, you can try that, but let's move on to how to stitch it on the back by hand. We're going to be turning this fold so that it matches up with the seam line that we sewed the binding on with. So some of these other lines that are here are because I was doing quilting around the edge or basted the edge down. So we're going to line this up with the one that's furthest in. So everything is going to be covered up by the binding. And I usually just have to use one pin just to get started. You want to have a thread color that matches your binding. And then to make a knot at the end of the thread, in case you're not a hand sewer already, I'll show you that. You just take your needle and the end of your thread, so they're opposite here. I'm going to hold that thread down against the needle, spin this around a few times, just like that. Put my thumb and index finger on that and just pinch that, and you're just going to pinch all the way down to the end of the thread and there's a little knot. You don't want that knot to show, so you can just start back here, put your knot there where it's hidden inside, and I'm going to come up into the binding, and it helps if you put a thimble on this finger. I find this is the finger I use to push the needle through. My thimble is just upstairs instead of in my studio. So I came up through the thread. Now I'm going to go down right at that same spot through into the quilt, but not through the quilt. The needle's not coming through the other side here. This is the pin here, but the needle is not coming through the other side. It's slipping in between the layers. And then just come up into the binding again. So again, down into the quilt, right next to where you came up in the binding, slide along inside the quilt so it doesn't come all the way through to the front. Push that through the binding, and you can see each one of those just makes a little tiny stitch. And if you keep that closer, and you keep that initial stitch in close to right underneath the binding, you can barely see that stitch. I just fold that over, I keep going, and I have this finger under here. It will tell me, I'll be able to feel the needle if it comes through all the layers of the quilt. You'd feel it against your finger. Not poking, just you'd feel the metal of the needle against your finger. So you don't have to keep checking the other side to make sure that your needle isn't poking through. You'd be able to feel it. So that's what it looks like. And in the front, it matches. The binding is the same width on both sides, and the seam attaching it is practically invisible. And again, you could do this by machine, but I find sitting in front of Netflix doing this by hand is much less stressful than trying to do this with my machine and the big quilt, heavy quilt. So I'm going to show you how to do the corner now. This is easier and faster for me to do in person. Right now I'm trying to do it through the camera, but I've come to right the corner here, and I'm just going to put one extra stitch in here. And this folds out like this, and this is why you've reduced some of the bulk by cutting off those corners of the batting. But you could just fold this over like this. I'm going to match this up just like I'm going to when I'm sewing, and the two corners are going to match up here. And I'm just going to put a couple stitches through those two corners. And then I just start stitching down this next side. And you can see there's a miter on this side that matches the miter on this side, which no matter how much light I try to put on there, believe me, there's a fold here and it matches the fold on the other side. So you just do that around the quilt. I'm going to take this upstairs now and finish this binding so that I have a finished quilt. I hope this tutorial will help you have a finished quilt as well. If you have further questions, please let me know down in the comments.